Okay, so that was the first presentation by Hadi Najafi. And now I'm moving to the second presentation, which is focused much more on the tech implementation. So I'm going to show you more in detail some of the features that we built, and also some of the ways that we did so. I'm going to stop quickly if there's any questions in the meantime, and I'll have time for questions at the end as well. Okay. So here's the MOOC. And again, we were really interested. My background, by the way, I'm a PhD student, final year in basically digital learning. And I'm also, for the last few years, I've been the data manager for edX and Coursera at the University of Toronto. So I spent a lot of time looking at learning analytics and seeing kind of the back ends of courses. And when courses finished, how do we get the data out? How do we process it? This was my first time actually building a course in edX. But I had some experience with the platforms. And so I was initially quite concerned about, my supervisor had all these grand ideas about how students should be interacting according to his theories. And we were, both me and Hedi had worked with the platforms. We were kind of trying to, dampen his enthusiasm, saying, you know what, it's quite difficult in these MOOC platforms to do many of the things that you want to do. And of course, we were a very small team. We didn't have a huge amount of programmers who could just create anything you wanted. But I think we're still able to do some interesting things. I'm going to talk a bit about technology choice because I think, and I haven't heard many presentations here touching much on it, but I think it's interesting. I come from the computer-supported collaborative learning background, and in that culture, we say interface matters for the kinds of interactions you're having. So the way you design a discussion forum, whether you use a discussion forum or a blog or Twitter, actually has an impact on who's talking, what they're saying, and how their collaborative learning process happens. And we believe that quite strongly. And there's a lot of people I could cite here, but you could do worse than reading some of Daniel Suther's early papers. Now, I would say, as also a technologist, the kind of stack that you choose matters for the kind of interface you end up building. This isn't necessarily as causally related, but I think if you look at the process of designing this technology, and again, especially for a small team that's very time limited, if your tech stack makes certain things easy, you're much more likely to try it out. Whether that means just iterating quickly, or it means things like, if you can do live real-time updates easily, if you can do video conferencing easily, you'll put it in there. If you can't, you're much less likely to try it out. So I think it's something that's worth discussing. Now, the second issue is how do you interact with edX? How do you expand, customize edX? And as far as I know, there are basically two options. LTI, Learning Tools Integration, is a generic way of plugging into LMSs. Coursera supports it, Blackboard supports it, probably most LMSs support it in some way. This edX specific way is to develop a custom X block. So X block is kind of the smallest component in edX. Now, the problem with X blocks is that you can't actually, as far as I understand, use custom X blocks on edX.org, right? So you can. Okay, so maybe you can. That's great.
Well,
or maybe you will be able to. That's an interesting discussion.
it's a political decision, not a technical.
Right, so, well, for sure. Either way, the idea of edX is both a software platform that is open source on GitHub. It's also a website, right? So you can download it and run yourself, and then you can do what you want, and you can develop all the X blocks you want and plug them in. I haven't tried, so I don't know how easy it is. But it's also the edX.org official website, and obviously there has to be more concerned about stability and stuff like that. LTI basically sits completely outside the platform, and there's a very thin layer that where they communicate. So makes it much easier to integrate, but makes the integration a lot shallower. For LTI integration, you can choose between an iframe, which means basically a website that's part of another website, or just going to a new full page. The only information you get by default is a unique ID that doesn't correspond to anything else, but it will be the same every time the same student comes. However, if you do a full page load, you can also ask in the settings to get the edX user ID and the email. The reason you can only do that in a full page load is because on a full page load, the student has to click a button, and edX can then say, do you agree to give your student ID and password to this external site? Whereas in an iframe, it's loaded automatically as you enter the edX site, and so it makes sense that they wouldn't allow you to do that without the permission, right? That's really the only data that you can access. So as an external LTI component, you don't know which videos that student watched, you don't know what they did on some edX quiz. It's a very thin integration, right? The nice thing, as I said, is not specific to edX, so theoretically we could take the tools that we built and just dump them into Coursera. You can do, because it's completely external to edX, you can basically do anything you want within that iframe or in that new website. So that, including you can write it in any programming language, you don't have to worry about edX APIs and so on. And because in our case we were running it on our own servers, we got immediate access to analytics data from our component. So that's actually really helpful as well. And this is a blog post I wrote February 30th. So this was when I was just starting to explore what was even possible. And the thing that really helped me with edX2 is that it's open source. Now, I don't necessarily want to read a lot of that source code. I had to read a tiny bit. But the most important thing was that I could very quickly get it running on my local computer, and thus I could try out the integration. Now, one thing is actually the LTI app. Another thing is how can we talk to the edX platform? And as far as I understand, they have a very limited set of APIs. So the only thing we can really do so far is you can have this LTI component, and you can also submit grades back. So you can do something in the LTI component, and it can send the grade back to edX. That's about it. So for example, we actually used data from the edX component to put people into groups, and we wanted that translated into cohorts on the edX side. And we couldn't do that very easily. We had to manually upload CSV files a few times a day. There was no way for us to access the edX forums. We had 10 groups. We wanted to post different things to different groups automatically. We couldn't do that. And there's also no live streaming analytics from the edX part. You get a dump every week or more often. So I used Elixir to build all the local servers. And I'm mentioning this because it's a fairly unknown language. It's actually, however, built on Erlang, which has been around for 30 years, and which I think runs 95% of the telephone exchanges in the world. It's basically built to be incredibly scalable and fault resistant. And then Elixir comes on as a kind of a very user-friendly interface. And why I'm mentioning this is because I think this is a great match for writing MOOC software. Because you want something that can serve 50,000 people. You want something that isn't going to crash over if one of them does something crazy. And the nice thing is it also has very strong support for WebSockets, so live interaction, which we used, background workers, mail servers, integrating with all kinds of services. So it's a neat thing. And it's funny because their conference is actually running right this weekend, so I've been following their tweets as we were here. All of the code that we built is on GitHub, and we actually deployed directly from GitHub, so you can follow all the commits where I'm like, oh my god, quickly fix this problem. But anyway, all the code is there, and we also try to think about ways of reusing and sharing this code, because it feels, you're spending. I basically spent 3 months in a little village in China writing this code this summer. And then you feel like, okay, the MOOC is over in 3 days. Do I even bother fixing this bug? Because it'll never be used again. So what I tried to do was to make the code as modular as possible and to share as much of it as possible. So we already have a few different libraries, including an LTI library that didn't exist before, a few different blog posts. We're trying to kind of share the stuff that we build and make it useful for others. Apparently I don't have much time, so I'll quickly skip through some of the stuff we did. This is the survey we used for the course at OISE, and we just used a Google form. R Shiny is a way of doing a very quick interface for statistics, so we could, in class, right away see some of the different statistics on the students in the class and put them into groups, and then take that data and automatically generate wiki spaces and permissions for them. Now, I've worked a lot with surveys as analytics for Coursera and edX and also for other stuff. And there's so much boilerplate that you have to write to say this is not a value, this should be an ordered, categorical variable or whatever. But you already have that data when you define the survey. So we came up with a very simple description language for surveys, text-based. So now you can do a very quick diff if you're collaborating with people. It's a very simple format, so everyone in my group was able to collaborate on the surveys. We can automatically generate HTML with all kinds of validation. And now we can automatically generate all the graphs, right? So we could quickly see what people are doing. And once we had this, we started using it for a lot of different forms, like reflections. We could have little questions in the reflections and quickly check how people were doing. That's a component that I would love to make standalone. We had these forms where we added resources, reviewed resources, all this stuff I showed you already. So the thing that we worked a lot on is really this capstone project for the people who did the design projects, because here we wanted this idea of a persistent team, and there's not a lot of MOOCs that have really tried to do that because it's very difficult. You have the dropout, you have the coordination, the time zones, all that stuff. So one of the things we did was we built this collaborative workbench. So this was a full screen interface where you always had a chat on the left side with the people in your group, and you had these different tabs that would differ for each week. So you have the welcoming. Each week there would be kind of the prompt. This is what we want you to do this week. You would have the description that you could edit. You would have an Etherpad, a new one each week, but you can always go back to the previous ones. And then we added the wiki, which is where you would publish your final project. And the wiki was the only thing that was public. So your discussions on Etherpad and stuff like that was private to the group, but the wiki would be shared back to people who are reviewing. And this is where we thought a lot, because we found, on Wikipedia, it's easy for a lot of people to collaborate because I add the capital of Norway and you add the population of Norway, and there's no real conflict. We don't really need to talk about it. Whereas, so the first week where people were brainstorming ideas for designs, they were doing great. Second week, they had to choose one. And it was really difficult for them because they wouldn't necessarily log on at the same time, and nobody felt like they didn't want to. It was a nice idea. They didn't want to railroad everyone else and say, we're going to just choose this one. So one thing we did was we added notifications, so you get an email every time someone entered the group. And these were only 4 or 5 people, so it wouldn't be that many emails. But we found from the server logs, a huge amount of people actually clicked on that link that would take you straight into the collaborative workspace without needing to log in or go through edX. And so people would see that and say, oh, okay, I'll go in too, and now we can actually have a conversation. We also added the ability to do anonymous email groups. So you could send an email from the website, and that would go from a specific email address. When you responded to that email address, it would go to all the other people, but your email address would never be shared because we need to concern privacy. That, unfortunately, wasn't used very much. Then we had this thing which took way too much code because it's actually pulling in diffs from every single Etherpad for each week, every single wiki edit, how many people edited the wiki each week. But this was a really cool way for us to be able to track the progress of the different groups. And then you click on any of these and you can go straight to their wiki and Etherpad and see how their progress is, come in and maybe assist the groups. We had TAs that were working with the groups. This was the last week. We actually built a little interface for a live session. So we had this kind of Google moderator thing where you could vote up and down ideas and comment on them. Then we had a live chat, and then we just embedded a Google Hangout on air. So this worked really well, and students loved it. They were like, why didn't we do this every week? And we're like, well, we just programmed it. But I think in the future, having more live events is something that the students really liked. The gallery walk, where some of the best projects are publicly available, is on that link. You can go and look at it. And so, everyone this morning we're talking about MOOCs, more social. Our platform is the most social, right? And I think and interactive and collaborative and all that stuff. And I think there's clearly a huge demand for that. Now, when it comes to how we do this, how do we design these interfaces? There are some really great examples to take from the human-computer interaction people, from the computer support collaborative learning people. Do you have a chat that's actually indexed to a graphical object where you can go back and front in time? That might be really good if you're working in a math project. Do you have some kind of a knowledge building interface where you can drag nodes around and stuff? Like, there's so many different examples of this that we should really look at. So to conclude, we need more deep research about how these students learn, about the challenges they have in collaborating. And there's, group awareness, the team effectiveness. There's a lot of research that we need to. And we need to document ourselves, because I feel like a lot of the papers tend to be a lot of statistics and numbers and 800 MOOCs. But we need to look at deep dives into specific examples as well and document it, share it. And then looking at the technology piece, I'm curious about how we can make it easier to share, because we write so much custom software, whether it's little scripts or integrations and stuff like that. Is it as libraries in a specific, Elixir now has an LTI library, it didn't have before. So that's one very simple thing to do. Is it as Xblocks for a specific platform? Is it as social as a service? So for example, TalkBack, I think it's called, is something that was developed that you can it's just hosted somewhere else and you can plug it into your MOOC. Is it as LTI components? And for me, the ideal thing would be if I could go to edX and set up a new MOOC and go to the marketplace. I need a forum. Let me see all the forums that people have developed or integrated, and I want this forum added to my course. And I know the platforms have all been talking about this. There might be stuff already happening, but I'd love to see that. So here's your goat picture. Thank you.